Okay, here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Research Connection series talk. My name is Jun Jiang. I'm a research engagement manager here based in San Francisco. So happy that you are all here with us today. We host the Research Connection speaker series to highlight the growing collaborations across our teams and also the innovative work happening in the industries that Autodesk supports. I just want to do a quick plug here. If you have a speaker you want to nominate in the future, after I'm done talking, I'll put in the chat a link to submit a nomination. So you can invite your speaker to give a talk in a future Research Connection series talk. And we have a great speaker today who will be introduced by our researcher, Dagmara. And sorry, Dagmara, I forgot your title. Maybe I'll have you tell the folks here, or a lot of the folks here already know you. I will let you take it away. Please, Dagmara.
Thanks, June. Thank you all so much for joining us. Yes, hi, I'm Dagmara Škurvac. I'm part of the Enliven Design research team over at Autodesk Research. And I'm really pleased to be welcoming Professor Hugo Spiers from UCL today. My research team, we've been working closely with Hugo as well as his colleague, Fiona Zish, who actually is also joining us on the call tonight, I believe. In their roles as co-founders of the International Center for Neuroarchitecture and Neurodesign. And you should definitely check out their 100 Minds in Motion experiment, which was studying crowd behavior at a whole new scale. Now, Hugo is also well known for his citizen science project using a video game to study spatial navigation and its connection to dementia, as well as his contribution to the Nature Human Behavior paper using games to understand the mind. And it's exactly this perspective that makes him such a great person to speak to us today about what virtual environments can and cannot tell us about human behavior. And so with that, Hugo, over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. It's been a pleasure working with you and Keen at Autodesk and collaborating. And thank you for taking your time in various time zones to hear this talk. I was given the title, which is quite fun actually, to someone says, could you talk to this? Which was what science can learn and what can and cannot learn from virtual worlds, which has kind of been a topic of my research for nearly coming on to 30 years. I realize I've been doing neuroscience research from a very young age onwards to now. And I thought I'd cover in this talk, if it lets me on the next slide, I'm going to explore a number of questions. First of all, just framing what's meant by a virtual environment is not a completely obvious thing these days. And a big question that comes up when we talk about this is behavior similar in the real world to these virtual environments? Do people behave in the same way? Can you learn much from it, which is the perspective we're going to look at today. And then the question set here is a great one, which is what is difficult and impossible to learn from virtual worlds. We should think about when we do this research, what are the serious limitations? It's not all, yay, virtual is everything. I mean, and everyone be aware in the news that the multiverse was just reduced by Meta. They're not going to be supporting this giant virtual world in the same way anymore. So there are really interesting questions around that. But what can we learn? I'm going to cover some of my research and other people's research about why these are useful, why they were not just games that are just for fun. There's actually some majorly important things. And I'll end on kind of like where we've gone with that. So the first question was like, what's meant by a virtual environment? If you ask Google to give you some examples of virtual environments, this is what you'll get. This is one of the more interesting ones. But it's either a computer generated, which is this, or a film generated environment that people can interact with in some way. It's not just a picture or just a movie. There's got to be some interactive component. But typically these are 3D rendered environments people can move through and typically move where they want to within that. So just that picture there, if it was a virtual environment, you could choose where you wanted to go. And now when we look at the term virtual reality, it typically now in most people's minds as kind of appropriately is when you wear a headset, which is referred often to a head-mounted display. Pilots have been wearing head-mounted displays since very early, probably the 60s or something. They've been building head-mounted displays for pilots. But these have been a kind of development of, and this goes back to these kind of headsets to the 70s, well, sorry, 90s is when that technology really started, but boomed in the last years. But I think this has become virtual worlds a bit more confusing and unclear when we have augmented reality, where we can fully like overlay things into the world, or mixed reality, where you can interact. The interface actually interacts with things in the world around you. So if you select something, something happens in mixed reality potentially. And then, as I've done in other research, which I won't talk about today, is it's possible to create film simulations where it's not computer generated at all. You're in a film simulation and you're able to look around and choose and potentially move to other points in a film. And that, again, is not typically used in the research, but is a fascinating thing to do. And I think we've not really used that, in my mind, enough as a kind of method to get at kind of what we're looking at today. But really, when it comes to like behavior and how similar is behavior in virtual and real worlds, it's a crucial one. And the reason this is important, of course, is that if you want to, have people play video games or do things, you want them to feel like they're engaging in something real. But really, for research, the questions that have gone into training is one of them. I'm not going to talk to the top examples, but training of neurosurgery, it's quite dangerous to train some sort of young medical student how to chop into people's real brains. So funnily enough, things like virtual reality are really useful. And it's not that they're just nice, that they really have improved. And neurosurgical planning often involves virtual like assessments and thinking about where scalpels are going to go. But that's just one example from virtual reality being having and that being actually really, quite successfully accurate. A big topic of research, which I won't speak too much today, is this topic of like, if you create avatars in virtual worlds, how close do people feel to them? Do they stand at the same distance? And the answer is no, often they don't. And do people get upset about people in different ways in virtual environments? Do they take risky behavior in different ways? And can you simulate stress tests of people are shouting at people or watching an audience watching you feeling more and more bored as you speak? Have been kind of virtual reality questions about where can you make it real? And a lot of the questions there are about the fidelity of the graphics and the interactive nature. The more you, a big point in these is immersion. So immersion or a sense of presence are big kind of topics in virtual reality. Do I feel present in this environment? Do I feel immersed? And some of that can occur where there's multisensory. So if you're smelling things that are there, you're touching things, things you interact with move. But the one I'm really going to talk about is spatial behavior. I got kind of obsessed with spatial memory and spatial behavior, and particularly navigation 25 years ago, discovering work that would then go on to win a Nobel Prize at UCL, where scientists have discovered how cells in our brain represent the world around us. And these don't do it in a really simple way. They're not just respond to light. There's a lot of very simple-ish bits of your brain, but these spatial cells have been fascinating indeed, won a Nobel Prize. So I won't really talk about that much tonight. But it got me interested in all the ways we can study people in space and their memory and their imagination and how they move. So here's an example of a kind of question on this journey tonight of, what can we learn from where's the kind of limit? How does virtual reality compare to the real world? And here's a really, I've been asking, probing, actually reading around for this topic tonight because I think you know something, but you read. And I would say one of the things I've found that I'd like to feed to the audience is there's a hell of a lot we still don't know. There's a lot of published papers, but there's not that many actually really systematically answering this question. So an expert I wrote to recently confirmed that and said, yeah, you're not wrong. You can't find these, but there's not that many. So this is an example where they took, I think, like a university setting or a hospital. On the left, you can see a photograph into this world. And on the right is a virtual reality render of the same place. And this is by a team led by Arne Ekstrom in America. And they had three groups of people. One group they went round this let's say it's a hospital, learning where things were. And the other two groups, one went round in an immersive headset, walking on a treadmill, learning the environment. And the last group just played it like a video game on a flat screen. And they then all went into the hospital again, like the actual environment. And they were kind of like, well, if virtual reality is rubbish, then the people who did that method will be terrible at finding the way in the real world. And the answer was like, they're a little bit worse, but boy, they can do a good job. You can see there's missing things in the virtual. So some of the problems might be like that fancy painting on the left. It's not there in the virtual. So there are sort of really tricky methodological questions. But this is just one really well done, good example of an experiment showing there are differences, and there's a tiny advantage to wearing a headset. Here's another study that I could find, for example, by another team looking at evacuation behavior. So not wayfinding, but just how the hell do I get out of this space? And they didn't compare it to the real world. They compared it to a virtual simulation of a real space, either as this person on the left is doing, looking at a computer screen like a video game, or in an immersive headset, where they can rotate, but they can't move. They have to press a button to move. And the upshot was the people on the left in the computer game type scenario were actually more efficiently getting out of the building than the people in the immersive headset. And so this paper highlights the one on the right, this cool immersive world isn't always better. It isn't the case if you just keep adding things, you'll or make people more and more immersed, it will work. But that may be a lot to do with the fact that the person on that right can't actually move. He's physically standing there and it's weird. Whereas the person on the left may well have spent many hours in video games and got round the weirdness of it's a video game. So I'm now going to be quite egocentric and talk mainly about my own work from now on. So there are other interesting papers, but surprisingly not many. And I can obviously answer lots of questions about this. So Fiona Zisch is on the call, and this is a paper that she and I collaborated on many 10 years ago. We ran in a building called Pamela, a predecessor to the new Pearl laboratory at UCL, I'll mention at the end. And this did build off this Nobel Prize winning work about how people understand where they are in a room or a space and how they use geometry. And so in this experiment, rather than find your way in a hospital, it was go pick up a chair, take it out, and could just put it back again. All you've got to do is take a chair out of a room, go in and put it back where you found it, but put it back as best you can remember in the room. And the only thing that's different before when you went in and came out is that we've moved the walls. So we've had like an interior decorating team move in. In fact, you can see in the middle image here, the team moving these very large carpented wooden walls around on a frame. And that meant we could go, and you can see a sort of transform of people would go into a very small space, pick up the stool, leave, and then it would doubled in size of the space. There's four times the amount of square footage or whatever of the space. Or they're in the big space and it's now compressed. And we were interested in here, what you can see in this middle diagram is a number of different ways. There's, um, nine different, is that right? No, seven different ways you can solve that problem. So it's not a simple, it's not just like, here's the answer. It depends what you use. And so our interest was if we compare people who are doing this in the real world to people who are in a fully immersive laser scan version of the environment, completely walk around exactly in the same way, or somebody just sitting and playing it as a video game, would there be differences? And the upshot was there was very little difference. So you'd think, goodness me, like there's a big difference between going in a physical room, walking around, trying to pop something back, and just viewing it on a video, a laser scan render in a video game. And that's the little red dots on the right are the kind of like people putting it back in the right place. There's a lot of detail in the manuscript I'm skipping over here, but the top is the physical real world. The other two, the middle one is the augmented reality, sorry, the head-mounted display, and the bottom one. So there are some slight differences. They're not like it's not like there's no significance, but they're not something you would like go raving down the street going, "Wow, it's amazing what we found here." So we would like to redo this experiment in much bigger spaces, and we were limited at that time by what was possible technically, but hopefully we will find things. There was very little body cues playing a role, for example. Okay, so this is like the upshot of all of this is that, yeah, mainly virtual environments are pretty good. And actually those desktop games are actually very, very similar when you put them to the test against immersive environments. And it will depend on a number of factors, and we really are still on the edge of knowing more about it. But here's the kick, like, what is it we cannot do? And this is a great question of like, if you're going to work with virtual environments, like what are the limits? And one of the most important ones, I think, is long-term continuous exposure to an environment, immersion in an environment is not something ethically you really kind of want to do. So the point of that would be if you want to see if you built the best kind of like recuperative hospital in the world, and your test for that, and they're going to be there for 3 weeks, is they have to wear over their eyes for every single waking minute a headset. It's not plausible because it'll become so aversive, this physical constraint. Similarly, on a flat screen render, having to be entirely and only in that environment is going to have significant cost to your eye strain, physical, all sorts of issues. So if you want to understand humans in a physical environment for long-term exposure, VR is not going to be your friend in this case. It's not to say you couldn't study how over a year someone finds their way, or many years, in some large virtual world. You could do that. You can have people do that. They'll learn spaces, but it's this immersion where you want to understand, is this place good for like your health sitting in it, or is this? It seems obvious, but it's a really kind of like not discussed. The other one to be aware of are things like daylight. You can simulate daylight, but the actual spectral properties of the light you're getting and the time of day and how they relate to your movement are going to be really hard to simulate in VR. You might try and approximate it, but I think it's a really big question. You can pump smells into people's nose in VR. There's a team that built a smell system that can pump, roses or petrol or whatever they want to pump into your nose at different spaces in a virtual world. But there are some things that are going to be hard, and daylight is going to be one of those. But there are many other variables like that. But what I'll talk about now is like you just cannot look at deep structures of the brain using kind of immersive VR, sorry, the ambulatory VR or in real world environment. Like we need to use um, um, different systems that are not compatible with ambulatory moving around or VR headsets. So what can we learn from virtual worlds? And as I said, quite a lot. That first one, going to that point, we can learn how the whole brain, deep structures, outside structures, are used by spatial behavior. We can explore how senses, vision, touch, smell, auditory processing are interrelated. And this second one, a lot of people do with other animal models. So they're interested in how the brain represents the distance traveled, and they can separate distance of running from what the animal is seeing, and they're tons of like very well-funded labs doing all sorts of fancy stuff. One thing I'll talk about tonight is that virtual worlds can be very useful for diagnoses of things like Alzheimer's disease. There's many teams around the world investing lots of money in trying to use virtual worlds, and I'll talk about why that would be the case. It's very hard to test thousands or millions of people in a real world environment that you can get, so there is some values in having virtual environments that you can virtually, and finally, in lots of different environments, you can ask questions about what makes somewhere hard to navigate or understand systematically. Of course, you can look at, you can think of lots of NHS hospitals I've been to that are very hard to navigate and understand, but scientifically separating out exactly what about them is hard, and we've done a bit of that. So I mentioned at the top, if you're going to record from brains, there's very cool ways to do that now and all sorts of mobile ways. But if you want to see deep inside the brain, you're going to need currently still going to need to use this kind of device, which is many, many tons of weight, a magnetic resonance imaging scanner. And back 20 years ago, to show an example of how virtual worlds have been useful, I was able to adapt a video game, a great challenge from a PlayStation 2 game called The Getaway, and put this inside to project a video game on a screen. So PlayStation, people had a PlayStation controller that was completely metal free. Took 3 months of engineers to build my own personal PlayStation device. But the people lay inside the scanner, looked at a flat screen inside there, and explored a virtual world. And this was one of studies that go back to the late 90s. What we were able to do, because Sony Computer Entertainment Europe had built this game, I'll just now see if I can bring up the video I saved earlier. Here we are. So this, hopefully you can see. This is a screenshot of a part of the game, The Getaway. It's a violent cops and robbers film with lots of cockneys in it shouting at each other. But it's a lot like that Guy Ritchie film. I've forgotten its name now. But you can drive all sorts of vehicles around London, and it simulates traffic. This is King's Cross as it used to be, which was horrible. And you can drive, as it turns out, a black cab in this environment. And this is me driving, so I'm not great. It's not easy to drive this. I'm a better driver in the real world than this. So you can see St Pancras Station looks pretty similar to it does now. That building on the left is now very clean. But we'll drive past O'Neill's pub, hotel, the British Library on the right. It's not perfectly rendered, but it did use Ordnance Survey data. It did use photographic capture back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it cost £2 million at this point to be able to build this. And there are pedestrians walking around, they jump out your way, and it's like Grand Theft Auto, but for a real city. When they went to remake this again, they realized we don't want to spend £2 million. There's Euston, for example, on the right. Fiona and I had a coffee in the place on the left earlier, the Friends Meeting House. And then just up ahead is the Wellcome Trust, who had funded all the research that actually paid for the expensive helium that you need to scan people. So here's me setting down. So what we found with that was a whole range of discoveries because we were able to use London taxi drivers. They could describe exactly what was happening to them when they were making decisions. And we could pull apart and find, for example, that a key bit of the brain called the hippocampus is particularly active whenever you need to plan your route from scratch. So there's many things we found out about the brain using that virtual environment that would be impossible to put that MRI scanner into the back of a taxi. You still can't do that. You can get other signals near the scalp or look at oscillations, but you cannot get this deep story. Okay, the next part of my talk is kind of jumping into the main project that Dagmara talked about, where I was very fortunate to receive significant funding from a sponsor to run a study. And this study we ran, myself and Michael Hornberger, who's a clinical researcher, was driven by this graph, was one of the big things from Al's Forum. And this is about biomarkers in Alzheimer's and clinical disease stage. The end of that graph on the right where the arrow is death. This is the point at which people die, unfortunately. And on the left, going down is normal on the left. So this is normal. And the important point in the middle here is these dotted lines indicate where people start to report serious problems with their cognition. They cannot function in their daily life. They're no longer able to hold down their job. The dotted line on the far right is a diagnosis of dementia. At that point, you are likely to be in a care home. You're not going, it's very late to the point. So, and what you can see here are some of the biomarkers occurring 20 years building up in people's brains. And you wouldn't know that they're there. And so this project was all about, can we detect people in this gray zone before they've reached this clinical stage? It'd be extremely helpful to do that. It looks like blood biomarkers are making great progress now. So since this project kicked off, people could start to get blood tests that may help. But ultimately, some people have got, a good cognitive reserve and they're at risk and may not realize. So blood biomarkers with the kind of testing. Now, Alzheimer's disease is famous. People are very famous for memory problems, people not remembering things. And that certainly is true later in the disease. But one of the earliest problems that patients report is being disoriented and sort of not being able to find their way when they go out somewhere new or in a supermarket. And they can remember all about the events. They've got the episodic memory of what happened, but they just couldn't find their way. And sadly, on the NHS or internationally, there's no test of being disoriented. It doesn't exist. So Deutsche Telekom decided to partner with us and Alzheimer's Research UK, the large charity that funds Alzheimer's research, to help us create with a games company called The Glitchers, a video game. And the idea was, what if we could make a virtual world and a navigation test that would fit in your pocket and you could play on your mobile phone, and that we would have the budget to reach out through the app stores to tens of thousands of people to get their data. Because then we can benchmark. Just when a baby's born, you need to know, is it a healthy weight? And the only way you're going to know if your baby's a healthy weight is that they've weighed a lot of babies and they know what's normal and not normal. So for this, we want to know what's off the scale bad or exceptionally good, but mainly the off the scale bad is what we're interested in. So we had this game, we built it, we put it into 22 languages. It's in it's been translated into two different Chinese languages, into Arabic and Marshallese, which I may mention at the end of this talk, which is a Pacific Islands language. But it includes navigation and a range of navigation tests. It taps into whether someone has played video games before. and then you provide demographic information, a small amount. And from that, we've eked out a lot from this study. But here's what it actually looks like. So the glitchers built this idea. What I really liked about their idea for a test was that you get a little map. It's like an orienteering task. I mean, is that you have to get to a number of checkpoints, and then a little boat appears, and all you need to do is tap left or right of this boat to make it turn left or right, or swipe to make it go forwards. Most people haven't spent years on boats, so when they are trying to control a boat, it is annoying. Same in this game. It's annoying trying to learn how to control this. But crucially with water, you know where you can and cannot go. I get annoyed a lot of video games where you're a bit unsure where you can go. And then that's quite important for an older generation that you want to tap into. Oops. So yeah, you had to work out, you followed a map. You say once you've closed that little map, I'll go back. Um, this is level 8. So people have done 7 training levels before this. And this person's going towards the first marker. While they're playing this game on their phone, it's logging exactly where in the virtual world, like virtual GPS coordinates. And this is a very good navigator. They're taking an efficient route for checkpoint 1, checkpoint 2, going to checkpoint 3. If they were bad, they go back to a previous checkpoint and they're avoiding it there on the right because they've been there before. So we had 75 levels like this and other features in the game to track. So a lot people take photographs, they collect stars, they upgrade their boat, and they take photographs of monsters. And there's a lot of sharing. So I'm not going to show you that. This video is an animation where we've taken 101 people's data. So from the virtual GPS. Now, when we launched the previous study, it had 10,000 people, the next biggest kind of big project. We thought, whoa, what if we could get 100,000 people to play this? That would be awesome. And then we launched it on the App Store and on Google Play. And of me as a scientist, I'd forgotten that it turns out that Deutsche Telekom, with a 68 billion euro turnover, have a reasonable advertising budget. And that meant that within 2 days, we'd had 100,000 people download and play the game within 2 days. And then we were covered by a YouTuber. We had he had 5 million views on his advert within 2 days. Ultimately, end up with 4 million people. I'm not going to show you 4 million people navigating. I'm going to downscale it to 101. So they're going to try and go from the start position to checkpoint 1, 2, and 3 in this level. And there's 101 people here for a reason. One of them is a red dot, and they are a person who has a clinical condition of hydrocephalus and gets lost every single day at work. They've never managed to work out how to, they're fully functionally capable. They just get lost everywhere they go. The other 100 people in blue aren't random. The beauty of a 4 million people sample is you can pick people who are exactly the same age, the same gender, same education, same country, same levels of sleep per night that they have, same background, same motor speed. Absolutely, this is the kind of what people describe as precision medicine, where you want to know exactly how you're doing compared to a perfect match. And even though these people are all matched, at this point you can see the diversity of like a fingerprint that each person generates. There's 4 million people, not a single one of them navigates the game exactly the same. So this is extremely rich data. If I jump forward, you'll see that people do well, they keep going, but sadly, the last person to make it there is the red dot. They finally crawl over the line and reach the target, or maybe not. So it shows the precision that this can kind of provide. But it's important to note, as I come back, every single one of those 101 people played it independently. They never saw another soul in this virtual world. So what have we discovered? What does this allow us to do? It allows us to look at who are the best navigators in the world, and it turns out to be the Finnish people. They're just the best. The Swedes are second best. People in New Zealand do very well, but Scandinavia and North America that does very well, for example. And you can see in Europe where there are some countries where they don't do so well. And then this is what you get when you get 4 million people. And I had a call earlier. It's like, what would you need 4 million people for? Well, what you can do with that is that you can estimate the population level. So if you just take the raw data, Sweden wins way out there, but a lot of young men played the game, and that has a benefit. So if you account for all the demographic factors, Finland has the best navigators in the world. But what really explains it is their GDP. So right down here, Finland has like the high, and this is the conditional modes rank of the game. So we account for various factors in a statistical model, and Finland is the top winner. But at this point, where Keen is, Switzerland are the top in the world at that point in time for GDP. At this point, I think India were the bottom of the rank for GDP, and you can see that's an incredibly strong correlation where I can explain the navigation performance of people in different countries as a population from their GDP. Why? Well, it's because education, travel capacity, healthcare, all these things are tied into your GDP, and indeed things like access to driving and so on is going to be there. But the Scandinavians is a bit unusual as to why, and I'll come back to why they are particularly good, the Nordic countries. Now, one thing we noticed straight away from the data that on average is quite a big gender difference where men have an advantage playing this game. But it was interesting. So countries like Norway, it's like almost nothing. There's almost nothing between Norwegian and men and women. But in India or Saudi Arabia, there's a very, very big difference between men and women on their test of this navigation. And what we were able to show is that the World Economic Forum, who meet in Davos every year, they calculate a gender gap index to kind of highlight how different countries are progressing or doing. So, for example, Norway and Finland, their joint top rank of this for good reasons, that there's good representation of women in parliament, equal access to healthcare, equal access to education. Sadly, that's not true in Lebanon, Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, who are at the other end of this. And what you can see is that that gender gap in the world data for countries about access to different things does have a strong correlation again with this gap. So this axis on the left, up and down, is the gap between men and women. Upshot is there may be some biological differences between men and women, but my goodness, the main reason that men might perform better in navigating is just culture. It's that they've been raised to expect to do navigation tasks in a different way or engaged in different things. And you can see where the UK falls somewhere here. They're if you just studied UK and other countries, you think there was a huge difference, or not if you'd studied Scandinavia. Okay, so that's all fine. As I got to earlier for this talk today, is this great? We built SeaRequest. We got some cool data showing it has real world links to statistical things at country level. But what about real world behavior? And people wrote to us after we first talked about the data to say, "Oh, did you know that there's a national orienteering championship that 13 countries take part in?" And it just so turns out that your top countries in that map of the world, they all train children at school and they take part. And what we did was take the medals whole, how many gold medals or other medals each country in this test had obtained, and looked at their population average score in SeaRequest and noticed a very striking correlation. This is a very small sample. This is, you can get correlations between Nobel Prizes and chocolate consumption that are stronger than this. So take something like this with a pinch of salt. It's not a perfect, but it is evidence that there's some ecological validity to SeaRequest and things that happen in the real world. But of course, that's not enough. That's not going to convince someone that this is the perfect test for testing people. What we, of course, then did was actually to go and recreate SeaRequest in the dirty streets of London. So here's a back street around Covent Garden. We picked Covent Garden as an area to test in the real world people's navigation skill. And we created a kind of mock-up of SeaRequest. And here's a shot on the left of SeaRequest, and published this paper seeing whether if you're good at navigating in SeaRequest, are you going to be good in Covent Garden? And so here's the kind of zoom in. Hopefully, here you zooming in into London, and what you'll see is the GPS tracking trail of people trying to get to checkpoint 1, then 2, then 3, and 4. So just like in SeaRequest, in real GPS coordinates, we can see if people are good or bad. I can show you that people wandering well off into the space in Covent Garden. So this was the outcome of the result in Covent Garden, is that there's a strikingly strong correlation, which is what we wanted to see, between how well people did at navigating the real world and SeaRequest. There are some outliers who are very bad, as you would expect with this kind of test. And there is a male advantage because it's a UK population. But that wasn't enough. We thought, let's go another country. Let's go to France, test people in Paris, in the Montmartre area, and we get an even stronger correlation, again, with somebody who's an outlier, as you would expect in natural human populations. So just to take this a bit further, there are different game levels. There's 75 in our experiment. And what this is showing is that level one, where people train up, if I test you, you open up SeerQuest and you play the training level, it can tell me nothing about how well you will navigate Covent Garden. But as you go through the game and it gets a little bit harder, by level 16, it's like a 50 correlate, an R score of 50, which is a very strong correlation, and it just disappears when the virtual world becomes just so tough it's impossible. That's what level 43 is showing us. So it matters about how you, it's not just great, it works. And we did that with young people in 2019. Last year we published doing it with people in their 70s and showed yet again for level 11, this one here, we didn't run 18, 16, but run level 11 is perfect for predicting older people's real world navigation performance. Okay, I'm wrapping up some of the stories here, so I want to take questions. It's once you've got that game and you've tested hundreds of countries, we had 195 countries tested, but only data from 58 or so where you've got enough of a population sample, or in this case 38, to really look at it. And one of the questions we asked people in our app for those 4 million was, did you grow up outside a city or inside a city or some mix? And I thought maybe growing up inside a city is very complicated. There's a lot of options. There's many landmarks, really tough. Whereas outside a city, maybe that's more tough. There's big distances you have to travel. It looks pretty similar a lot of the time. Which is actually better for you? And what I'll now show you is this graph to explain it is how performance in our global sample falls away with age, because we see a very negative, the most strong predictor of navigation, unfortunately, is age. And on the axis here going up and down is performance. So a high performance towards 2 is a really good navigator. And as you go down to 0, it's the worst, unfortunately. And you'll see as we all get older, we get worse. There's a gender effect, so that men have got an advantage. But what we were absolutely struck by is this green curve where if you grew up outside cities, you'll have a big advantage in see her request over people who did grow up in cities. And if you look at the bottom of the graph, that's a 10-year difference for women. So a woman who grew up in central Manhattan versus out in the Rockies, there is a big, big difference. But it's not just as extreme as Manhattan and the Rockies, it's all over the world. But what made it interesting, our story, was it varied across countries. And we noticed that countries like the United States and Canada, there was quite a big effect of this environment. And at that point, an American geographer called Jeff Boeing had found a way to calculate just how organized every city in the world is. So here's Chicago and Prague, where you can measure how oriented to each other all the streets are. In Chicago, it's very north-south. It's super gritty. Prague is somewhat gritty, but not much. And if I show you down on this big shot of all the cities in the world, Sao Paulo is just a mess. Rome is down here. Rome is like everything goes. But Chicago, there's Vancouver, there's many other cities, Portland. But it's not just that. Buenos Aires, there's other countries with really severe, gritty cities. So that's this measure going up and down. And the axis at the bottom here is the effect size. We published this in Nature because we were able to statistically show that the more gritty the city is, the lower on this axis, the worse growing up in a city will be statistically. So growing up in Argentina and Canada in a city there will make you worse than average at navigating. Romania, to some extent, bucks the trend. You're better off growing up in a Romanian city. But that was with the project in Nature, we reran the experiment, for example, and reran it with a new virtual world. We also tested another 1,000 people to replicate the effect just to see, does it matter which city you live in now? And it doesn't. This is all about where you grew up. So you might grow to the hardest city in the world, but if you grew up in Portland, Oregon, tough. You've got that exposure early in life. But it's not a downer, as you always will show. We were able to look over our 75 levels and just how gritty they were. So level 42 is really gritty. It's not perfectly gritty, but it's oriented. You can see that in this chart. Level 68 is like Rome and Sao Paulo. You can go in every direction. And what we wanted to know, does this matter? So people who grew up in Buenos Aires, are they more sensitive to the grittiness within the environments? And that's exactly what we found is in this graph. We compared countries where they have very gritty environments. So that includes Australia, North America, and Argentina, for example. And there are other countries like the UK and Switzerland and so on that are very organic and disorganized relative to relative streets. everyone, on average, there is a negative effect of growing up in cities, but you can see it drops below the line for people who are in these gritty countries, where it turns out effectively that if you grow up in a gritty city, you will be better at navigating gritty environments. So it's not that grittiness makes your brain worse. It adapts you to a certain way of navigating. And it just so happens that most of the world isn't gritty. And so it is a challenge for people like that. But yeah, it was a real bit of a journey with us discovering that. So I'm just wrapping up now the last few points before I can take questions around this, where what else can we do so we can show this real world impact? I should say our journey with the game started with Alzheimer's, and indeed with See Your Request, we could predict patients who are in a care home, which ones are disoriented and which ones aren't. So it's useful for actually understanding behavior in Alzheimer's patients. But that's too late at that point. What we have shown is that people who are at high genetic risk of Alzheimer's, who are perfectly functionally normal holding down their job, are statistically worse at See Your Request. So we were able to identify the early genetic risk of Alzheimer's, and there are currently large cohort studies going on where perfectly healthy people are being tracked, and we want to see whether See Your Request can predict their progression if they do, because they're large samples into Alzheimer's. But what can we do to adapt back to question? One of the big questions perhaps at Autodesk is if you were designing a city layout or a building or a hospital, what is going to make it good to navigate or not navigate? And ideally, we would test thousands of people in real world cities and buildings and all be under the same conditions, but that's not going to happen. It's really hard. But with See Your Request, we've got 75 levels where we can look at performance over them, and we can look at which environments in there were really easy to navigate and which are really hard. And you can see what we're plotting here are just views into some of the environments and some of the maps they had to look at. And you can see as you go through the game, it generally gets harder, but it's not just time. So level 42 is very easy to navigate, for example. But each of these levels have different properties of them. And so the team took apart metrics from each of these levels. So we can take our Jeff Boeing street network entropy and work out for this given level I showed you earlier with 101 participants, the red dot, how disorganized is it as a level? And it's pretty disorganized, as you can see. But you can also look at segment lengths. You can look at axial lines from the space syntax analysis for those people that love space syntax. Yeah, there are very many diverse metrics. And this next plot in this paper we published, with a collaboration with Ruth Dalton and other colleagues, was to take these metrics and ask on this bottom level, how does difficulty map onto them? And this is just a massive dump of data. But the bottom line with it is that unsurprisingly, if you have many places to go, it's hard. If there's fog, it's hard. There's some obvious things. If you've got to navigate a very large area, it's hard. So we got rid of all the very basic, obvious things. But what we found was that street network entropy absolutely played out, that those levels where it's high are harder to navigate, but also the segment integration, so how the graph structure of the streets is integrated, will predict how hard an environment is to navigate. And crucially here, we know, as we said with Covent Garden and in Paris, that this predicts real world behavior. But how does this kind of map on to real world being lost and the properties of that? We don't know yet because people haven't followed up with more, but we absolutely do need to do it. And hopefully it's something Fiona and myself might be able to do, is to vary environments and find out which ones are particularly hard to navigate with real world settings, for example. And taking me on to, as I wrap up tonight, real world settings, this is exactly that which we've been doing. And you may have heard, if you've seen a talk from Fiona Zish, our work at the UCL Pearl Laboratory, the Person Environment Activity Research Laboratory, established by Nick Tyler, which is a 40,000 cubic square meters of modifiable space, where we did build our own kind of See Your Request environment where you've got checkpoints to get to, and it's got 12 different partition spaces to navigate through. And people were wearing QR coded hats rather than having a phone track where they were in a virtual world. We track them exactly where they are in this real world. And I'm just showing this is the top down. This is our ultra wideband system tracking 100 people moving around as they try and navigate this particular maze, trying to find their way to pieces of artwork which were checkpoints in this particular environment. And the reason I'm showing this is to highlight that what we will need to do is to compare 100 people all online, of course, to see does this actually translate? Do the findings from that experiment predict how people feel and move when there's 100 people in the virtual world? We don't know yet because most of the world isn't like SierraQuest. Most of it does have other people there. So we crucially do need to extend this out to real world environments, sorry, to virtual worlds. And it's not, and of course we're going to find differences, but the important point is understanding um, when do we see useful difference, and what are the things we can tweak to make it more similar, and what can we mitigate, what can we kind of appreciate that it may be less. Like if we find people are less stressed in the real world, we can predict it will be higher, for example. Um, so um, yeah, without further ado, I'd be very keen to take questions, other than to wrap up and say, not all like, virtual worlds have been great, but one particular example we've been looking at in our research where you do not want to be in a virtual world is out studying people in the oceans of the world, where we've been looking at ancient navigators using the sun in the sky and the stars and the wave patterns to navigate. And you could simulate this, but then you would miss this is our team out on a yacht. You'd miss a lot of the beauty in the real world. And this is a research we carried out last summer, looking at how people know where they are when that is your cues, that horizon is all you've got, and you have a team there eating their lunch. But this person here, Pablo, is a philosopher. We were able to record from his brain repeatedly out there, simulating that in a virtual world. Yes, but you're gonna have time, and that's our yacht there. Just to wrap up and say there are scenarios where you don't want to use virtual worlds because it would just not going to be matching that experience. So I'll thank funders and Fiona and Antoine Cotreau and Michael, who's crucial, and various other people who made a lot of that work possible, and take questions. Uh,
If you want to have a question, just raise your hand, I think is probably the way to go. Though there's so many clapping hands. Ah,
Thank
Mike,
you.
over to you.
Mhm. Hi, Hugo. It's lovely to meet you, and thank you for joining us today. It was really great listening to you speak. The team has told me all about your work, so it's lovely to see it sort of presented. I do think your final research project on the boat is a little questionable, though. I can not saying that, but anyway, two questions for you. The first one was, when you got into that difference between the person navigating the environment on the desktop versus either the VR or the physical world, there is an aspect to activating the problem-solving areas of your brain, right? And I would put this akin to trying to learn a math theorem. You could learn a math theorem by looking at the proof of the theorem, or you could sit down and try to prove the theorem yourself. The second way, you're probably going to have learned the theorem a whole lot better, right? Because I would guess you know more about this than I do. You've activated more of your mind. So, is there any study seeing the effects of the sort of activating the sort of problem-solving parts, which might be more akin to an abstract representation, like on a computer screen, because it's almost a game. It literally is a game. It's something,
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I for this talk, I did do a bit of a dive. I've been enjoying kind of giving the prompt to look at this question.
Yeah.
I really couldn't see a lot. So that kind of question, I don't think has been addressed.
Okay.
I think I'm really surprised how little we know about these. I think one of the things that may lead into what you're saying is there's this real sense of kind of context of I don't play personally hours and hours. I don't play any. I don't have the time. I have two small children to play these large virtual
Yeah.
worlds.
Yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
19-year-old that probably spends like, towards 6 hours a day
Right.
if he could
Right.
in these worlds, exploring multiple worlds. And the context for him and me is like hugely different about what I expect
Mm.
him to. So I think
Mm.
when I leave my office and I go out and around my house or wherever, I have loads of built schemas about what's going to
Yeah.
happen. And I think
Yeah.
they come into play in virtual worlds. So I don't
Right.
think there's probably that kind of difference between maths and solving is um, it's probably it's more about the experience and context.
In
I
context.
think what
Yeah.
I've seen is the sense in which the
Yeah.
more these games have gone on, the more elaborate things you can do in them.
Yes.
And the
Yes.
movement away from just brutally killing has kind of thankfully gone down a bit, but
Right.
it's still a
Right.
major occupation because it's kind of
Yeah.
sadly we're like
Yeah.
chimpanzees, not so much
Yeah.
bonobos.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but I
Yeah.
hope
Yeah.
that
Okay.
answers your question. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
other
No, no, no. That's great. No, I was curious.
we know
So
very little. Yeah, go on.
my second question is so I mean obviously a lot of what you've talked about today was to do with wayfinding, navigation, placing in the world, spatial reasoning, that kind of thing. Obviously I think as you probably know, as part of the broader effort that Kian and Dagmara are running, we're trying to understand people's response to environments,
Hmm.
which obviously involves a whole lot more, and I mean,
Yeah.
and there's cultural aspects to this, and I 3 weeks ago I was in India at the AI conference there, and in India it's utterly acceptable to be literally crushed against 200 other people in a room
Yeah.
because hey, that's India. This India's got 1.2 billion people. This happens a lot, and it's like,
Yeah.
but in the Western world it's different. So, but in being crushed into a room, obviously I had a whole lot of other stuff going on. In fact, navigation was actually the least of my worries. I
Yeah.
was smelling, feeling,
Yeah.
temperature, talk about the sun
Yes.
shining on us. There was, all of these sort of things. So,
Yes.
my question actually, and I was fascinated by some of the early results that I remember Kian showing me early on in this project about the human response to seeing wood grain, for example, and how our brain actually emits some sort of like, I don't know what it is, some sort of chemical that, responds pleasure in some sort of pleasurable way to seeing natural phenomena like wood. How has there been a study where you looked across the different human senses, and got a sense of which ones are the most sensitive in environments? So like when you come into an environment, I'm presuming, taste is probably not high on the list unless, well, we won't even go there.
Yeah.
But there's certain things or certain combinations of those that are probably
Yeah.
the most acute. What have you
Yes.
seen?
Yeah, I think this is a new area of research, really. There's very
Yeah,
little. Like, so as I said, and it's not,
yeah,
I know there's a lot on sort of spatial behavior because it's kind of
yeah, right,
the
right.
Anderson and Nobel work. But the how you appreciate an environment is
Yeah,
relatively new. So Fiona and I ran a study looking at how people experience environments through film simulations. So we were putting people in films and
okay.
looking at all the qualities of spaces to see how they
Fascinating.
drive activity in the brain.
Mm.
And but that's only one sort of study out there. So we didn't ask that question. We were just literally visually driven. But we have
Visually.
asked the question about how what different aspects of a bad space. So you can have it's
Mm.
kitsch and it's horribly
Yeah,
kitsch,
right,
or
right,
it's
right.
just angular and like you could catch yourself and there's a lot of sharp
Yeah,
nails sticking
yeah,
out. And there are many reasons why an environment might be unpleasant that you can detect just by your
right.
visual system. So vision
Yes.
provides humans with a vast, I mean, it is the most dominant sense
It's
for
dominant. Yeah,
acquisition. But
right.
the next one's probably sound. We
Mm.
evolved on a savanna, and so listening. And Nick, who runs Pearl, is
Mm.
kind of really one of his points is often when you've
Yes.
got a large laboratory, you suddenly appreciate
Yeah.
sound in a way nobody
Yeah.
does. So see,
Yeah.
we don't have a good angle yet on what are the kind of main senses, but I can
Right.
highlight again, just even within vision, we don't know about how they get it. Like we just didn't have we couldn't scan people for 5 days, unfortunately, to separate out. But we'd
Sure.
love to. Fiona and I would
Yeah.
love to take apart, disgusting environments from like just kitsch or,
Yeah.
bad
Yeah.
design, just bad design. But anyway, I'll answer more questions. I've sort of, yeah. There's some
Yeah.
great questions. Thanks, Mike.
Okay. No, thanks, Hugo. It's great.
Nigel, you have your hand up if you want to go next.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk, Hugo. I'm sort of following on some of Mike's questions. On the visual side of things, I'm wondering, have you done any studies exploring like how well the virtual environments um, sort of capture people's impressions of the space depending on the quality of the visual like rendering? Because like nowadays we're seeing some really big improvements. I don't know if you saw, I think there's DLSS that NVIDIA is coming out with, which is sort of an AI way of enhancing the quality of even older games. And I suspect it might make a big impact on how well these environments can handle things. Yeah. So wondering what your
No, no,
thoughts.
you're spot on. And it is a question like if you render how well can an environment, um, if you were to expose someone like how they react to it and what they do, how could that predict things about like whether they're gonna like a real world version of it or want to buy that potentially, or this has been a long question, and certainly architects have been using virtual environments, as you'll know, for a long time to kind of sell and say, look, this is what it will be like. And I absolutely agree that the improved graphics are going to be a massive part of improving that. It just stands to reason. There is evidence of how people feel present depending on the graphics. So if it's really high fidelity, you will feel more there. And the there-ness of being immersed is a key feature of capturing that. So I think we will be able to get a better handle on what makes a good environment when you design it using that. But just bearing in mind those kind of limitations of if you want to see how someone might feel for weeks living in a space,
For sure.
you're still limited to that. And I think
I wonder also, do you think there's going to be an uncanny valley at some point as well? Are you seeing that in any of your
I,
like
I found, I must admit, if people on, I don't know if anyone here has seen Simmer 2 run, that I found an uncanny valley. So
uh
Simmer 2 is the melding together of a AI system that can learn what actions to take given 2 million hours of people playing video games with all their button presses. It learns what you should do. So if you see this, do that.
Right.
They melded that in Google with the Gemini large language model. And the uncanny valley there is that you can have an agent go into virtual worlds and you can chat to it and you can have a whole dialogue about getting it to team up and do a whole ton of physical virtually, as in, let's go build things together. But you see its reasoning as to why it thinks you're an idiot, or it's like not clear why. That's slightly uncanny because you think, wow, it doesn't have to be virtual button presses. It could be anything. These AI agents could start to actually proliferate in quite, interesting ways. But there is something weird about these agents where they are now reasoning and doing things and collaborating, that I find, but that's an agent in a VR. But they make a difference, right? For me, that is a huge question of when we go and try and take 100 minds to VR, what are the avatar? Are they real people or are they simulated agents? If those simulated agents aren't really feeling real, it is going to give us less data, but it's something to try and explore. Bottom line is this is a new Wild West and we don't don't know a lot.
Yeah, I had two questions. Thanks. Super cool stuff. I was wondering for the navigation games or for the navigations, did you guys consider or are there studies around navigation by street names versus by markers? Like a lot of, so for the grid system, street names is going to be a huge one. If you're not in that, then markers might be a better way. Or you can imagine if you're not growing up in a city at all and you're like, okay, you pass this tree or that tree, where you don't really have those. So that was one of my questions. And then second question, within the video game, do you guys try to control for color? Like I saw everything was blue as opposed to a green environment, or for people that are more used to a gray environment. Did you guys do that or
Yeah.
plan to do that?
Well, the second, let me pick up the second and go back to the first. So we submitted that journal to Nature, which is a very high bar because you're up against black holes and dinosaurs and stuff like that there. And we got through, but that was one of the reviewer questions. It was an excellent question. Was you guys are showing people that aren't in cities are good at driving a boat in a like a green landscape. So we spent a lot of money rebuilding an entire driving in a gray city virtual version of that task and found exactly the same effect sizes for growing up in a city and that. So it's not the gray, but it is a great question. Um, so yeah, no, but there's more to do there. But it wasn't all green. There was marshes and there was like rolling waves. There's a lot unexploited in Zero Quest. But your first question, if you could remind me what your first question was again, my brains.
Yeah, so people that navigate by
Oh yeah.
markers versus by streets, like, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. And in cities, that's right. It's certain big American cities, you're likely to use street names because they're very helpful there. And I think a lot of Londoners don't. It's quite hard. So we didn't manipulate street names or anything like that in the game whatsoever. So it's an unknown from that. But I didn't talk about it at all today, but a lot of my research has been with London Taxi Driver. I talked about that when we scanned their brains. But one thing we learned is that the power of their skill, the London taxi drivers, they have to memorize 26,000 street names. And that gives them this awesome power to go, oh, you want to get from here to here? I can tell you the exact graph route through that without error. And so I think it's something we've been looking at to try and see if we can train people up a bit to focus on street names because it's powerful. It will allow you to navigate better. But so far that's still ongoing and it's tricky. And I think you need to be a certain level of skill to do that. But no, we haven't manipulated that or asked really whether it's. I did get someone to write to me after we published our paper saying, "You're wrong. I read your Nature paper. It's wrong. The answer is fluoride." So I never replied to that letter, but it was one of those crazy worries people have about too much fluoride in our cities. I don't think the data's going to show that. But yeah,
Awesome. Thank you.
no problem.
Yes,
Okay, great.
June.
Sorry. Go ahead, Dagmara.
I was going to say, I guess we're at time, and I can see some folks are having to drop off for other meetings, but just wanted to say thanks so much, everyone, for joining us tonight and your great questions and engagement in the chat as well. I don't know, June, any final closing words?
Oh, no, not at all. Just the same, echoing Dagmara. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Professor Spiers, for such an inspiring talk, amazing questions from the audience. And yeah, we look forward to more discussions and seeing you all in a future Research Connections talk like this.
Thank you very much for
Thank you
inviting me.
all for joining us.
Thanks, Hugo. Thanks, everyone.